get to see and understand. Let's not forget what he said to Pharaoh. For this reason I raised you up. And so don't think that God is just letting the rest of the world spin out of control and that he doesn't know what's going on. And he's only concerned about what's going on in Israel and Judah, but that other things are moving, and as Paul said in Acts to the Athenians, he's the one that sets the times and the boundaries of nations. So it's sometimes easy for me to get micro-focused on Judah and Israel and think that God doesn't care what's going on in the rest of the world. But that's a little like saying today that he's only focused in on his church and the rest of the world is no concern of his. But we know that's not true. That are outside of us are still under God's control. And he knows exactly what's happening everywhere, all of that. But that's, that's one of the things that I have to remind myself sometimes, because I get so focused in on what's going on here. God promised to David. What kind of promise was that? We talked about two different kinds of promises that God makes.
It was a twofold promise, one conditional, one unconditional. If I'm reading right, that promise of having somebody always on the throne, there was the fold that Christ would eventually come and be on that throne forever. That was the unconditional promise. But then there was the conditional promise of those who followed him, which was mainly made through Solomon, but along that line, that for them to rule, they would have to follow after the ways of David, after his way.
Yeah, that was God's promise to Solomon.
Well, yeah.
His promise to David, like you say, was unconditional. David's seed would be established forever. David's kingdom would be established forever. David's throne would be established forever. And David's seed would have a father-son relationship with God.
That was a spiritual promise.
That's a spiritual promise of that. Now, when we get to Solomon's promise, then he told Solomon, if you, then I. That's how we know conditional promises from unconditional promises, because they don't have any if-then statements in them. And if you've ever worked with computers or computer programming and did a little bit in college, we always have these if-then statements. If this is true, then this is the route that it takes. If this is not true, then this is the route that it's going to take. And that's what his promise to Solomon was, that if you and your sons will follow my commandments and statutes, then you will always have a son to sit on the throne. We know that didn't happen. Because by the time we get to, and it depends on the translation you're reading, Coniah, Jehoiachin, or Shalom. In Jeremiah 22, he calls them all three different names. Jehoiachin was Josiah's son. No, Jehoiakim was Josiah's son. Jehoiachin was Jehoiakim's son. With him, we see the consequences of his sins breaking God's covenant, and we'll talk about that later on in the lesson. So the kingdom split up, as we saw in last week's lesson. The kingdom split up because of Solomon's sins. He ripped the kingdom out of the hands of his son Rehoboam because of the choices that he made. But the reason that happened was because of the sins of Solomon. Right at the first, Solomon followed everything God wanted, except for his first wife he chose from Egypt. So he didn't do too good from the get-go. So the kingdom splits into two different things, and I've used some bad coloring on this one. Does it show up there any better? Not much. Judah, pretty much, these are some of the characteristics of the two kingdoms, and we're going to discuss Israel first and then Judah. But Judah followed pretty much the law. Israel perverted Judaism right from the beginning and followed the ways of idolatry. The type of monarchy that Judah was remained in David's family all the way to the end. It was a single dynasty. In Israel, we see many dynasties going through Israel's history, and they were more ruled by might, whoever was the strongest, whoever could take over. Politically, they were relatively stable in Judah because they had one dynasty, one thought. Israel was completely unstable from the very beginning. As far as the international policy, how they reacted with other nations and stuff like that, Judah was pretty well isolated. They stayed more to themselves, more centrally located in Jerusalem, and stayed more to themselves, whereas Israel was trading and merchants and with everybody. They were more a cosmopolitan type of international policy. And their economic situations, Judah continued to be very poor after the first raiding of Jerusalem and stuff, almost completely agricultural, very, very little trade with other nations, whereas Israel was mostly wealthy and strong in trade. So you can see some of those characteristics of saying, Israel saying, well, God's with us because we're doing so well. And we're 10 strong. We've got all of these partnerships and all of these nations that we do have influence with. They're just some poor old dirt farmers down there in the south that don't know anything. And so you could see that kind of mindset that Israel may have had. One of the purposes of the divided kingdom was to drive the promises of Abraham and David. You remember the promises that were made to Abraham was to be a great nation, to have their own land, to be a huge multitude, have cursings and blessings for obeying or disobeying God, and then the last one, which hadn't been fulfilled, was that they would be a blessing to all the families to all of the nations of the world, to all of the families of the world. But the purpose was to show that God keeps his promises, even the bad stuff. I mean, he doesn't just, when he says, that if you obey me, I'm going to give you everything. First of all, that implies that if you don't obey me, you're not going to have everything. But a lot of times he'll come along and say, if you don't obey me, this is what's going to happen. And so it shows what happens when God's people wander from God. They had everything as a united kingdom, and they squandered it. Got me to asking myself questions. When we move forward to the spiritual kingdom, that first century church, it just sometimes seemed like maybe it had everything. They were all in one, at first they were all in one place, but they had all things in common, and they took care of each other, and they talked about the things that God was doing day and night. And then we look at the church or we look at people who call themselves Christians today, and we're sitting there thinking, well, that's scattered. That definition is scattered all over the spectrum. Have we squandered something? Are we divided up? Are we, we see a lot of divisions, denominations. Even within the church, there's been divisions, and denominations have come out of that. And we got to remember that this proves that God keeps his promises. God's redemptive plan continues to show us why man needs redemption. Because he fails time and again, he sins over and over and over. And God holds us accountable for our choices, but he also provides a solution. He always has this redemptive plan in place for a small remnant to escape the corruption of sin and to be redeemed to life again. There's always a remnant. There's always a remnant of people that are faithful to God, and there's always God being faithful to them. So let's look at the fall of Israel. Spiritually, they pretty much went straight downhill. There was a little time there and about four generations of Jehu that God said, if you'll obey me, if your sons will obey me, you'll sit on the throne for the rest of the time. It is Israel, but even his sons didn't. So there for a little while, they kind of hit this little flat spot, but it was pretty much, from beginning to end, it was pretty much downhill for Israel. Oops, I went too far on mine. So these are kind of some selections out of 2 Kings 17 that why Israel fell. God explains why they fell and why things happened. In the 9th year of Hosea, king of Assyria, captured Samaria, and he carried the Israelites away to Assyria and placed them in these different places and in the cities of the Medes. So they were scattered. And this occurred because of the people of Israel had sinned against the Lord their God, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt from under the hand of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, and they feared other gods. The people of Israel did secretly against the Lord their God things that were not right. They did wicked things, provoking the Lord to anger. They served idols, of which the Lord had said to them, you shall not do this. Yet he had warned them the whole time by sending them prophets. We see that with the minor prophets. We see that with even Jeremiah and Isaiah warning them in their writings and in their preaching. Turn from your evil ways and keep my commandments and my statutes, according with the law that I have commanded your fathers, that I sent to you by my servants the prophets. But they would not listen. They were stubborn, as their fathers had been, and who did not believe in the Lord their God. And they abandoned all of the commandments of the Lord their God and made for themselves metal images of 2 calves. And they made an Asherah, and they worshipped all the hosts of heaven, and they served Baal.
Can I ask you one question?
Yes.
What's the difference between a prophet and a minor prophet?
Oh, man's labeling. The prophets we think of as as far as the scriptures, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Daniel, and Ezekiel. The minor prophets are the 12 that follow those books only because their books aren't very long. They're short in length compared to 66 chapters of Isaiah versus 2 chapters or 3 chapters of Jonah.
Oh.
That's a label that man put on them. In the Jewish Bible, you have Isaiah, Jeremiah, Daniel, and Ezekiel, and then you have, they call them the 12. And that's what in English we call them a lot of times the minor prophets. Nothing minor about what they had to say.
Yeah.
Just minor in the amount that they wrote. Good question, because it kind of gives that pejorative type of thing, like the minor leagues compared to the major leagues, and we don't pay that much attention. These guys just aren't as good. No, that's not how that word is. That word's complete, and I don't even like calling them minor prophets. I do just because a lot of people associate that 12 with those, and we probably should try to change that, because it was minor. Matter of fact, there's some really good stuff in it.
I want what to do.
But that's why they call them minor prophets, is because of what. But they even got to the point of burning their sons and their daughters as offering, and used divination and omens, and sold themselves to do evil in the sight of the Lord, and provoked him to anger. And therefore the Lord was very angry with Israel and removed them out of his sight. None was left but the tribe of Judah only. Well, we know that God sees everything, and that they weren't totally removed from his sight, so to speak. But what he meant was he had disowned them. He divorced them.
Today, instead of burning our sons and daughters, they're being aborted.
Yes. And I mean, it's scary to read some of this stuff and think about what's going on in the world today, because there's so many things that you go, wow, we're doing the same thing that they did back then.
Amen.
We're repeating this history. We haven't taken a warning from their history, as it says in 1 Corinthians 10, I think. These things happen to them, and as an example for us to see how we shouldn't do things, for us to avoid that same problem, not to do the things that they did. And you're exactly right, Beverly. And that just makes you read this as burn their sons and their daughters, and it just sends shivers down your spine to think that 50 million babies just in this country. You have a question?
Yeah, well, it's
Comment.
our political leaders, so many of them don't believe in God and don't want to do anything. They'll make fun of you or whatever, so they have no sense of God in their lives at all. And
Yeah.
they get power and have great influence on the rest.
I thought the scripture there in 9, I guess it was, it said also, Lord, said also the children of Israel secretly did against the Lord their God things that were not right. How did they proceed? How could it be secret? But I guess the word secret there may mean they did it behind closed doors. They didn't do it in public, maybe, or something like that. God would have seen everything. It wasn't any secret to him what they were doing.
It wasn't an open thing they did.
It wasn't an open thing, maybe they were practicing, but they couldn't hide it,
They couldn't hide it, but
It's like you told David.
there's an attitude of like, oh, God doesn't see this.
Yeah. You're right.
Isn't that what in Ezekiel we see the same thing with him digging a hole through some of the things that he went through. He dug a hole through his wall, and he was looking into the temple, and the priests were in there doing things in the temple that weren't right. Ezekiel was seeing this from God, through God's eyes, but they thought that they were acting secret. Like, if I go out of town, none of my brethren will see me getting drunk and falling down and buying a prostitute or doing some crazy thing, because we wouldn't do a lot of the things that we do as people if we remember that God's sitting right here.
And that's what he, with David, he actually told David his thing with Bathsheba, you did it privately, what I'm gonna do it out in the open for everyone to
I
see.
mean, put it out in the open for everyone to see.
But
Yeah, I'm embarrassed myself, some of the things that I do, thinking, I don't know what I was thinking. What? God's sitting right in the truck with me. He's right there in the sea can with me. He's right there, in my house. And so I'm not doing anything in secret that I think that I might be doing in secret. But apparently Israel did think that, and there's a lot of people, I think, that do. So Assyria takes Israel captive. Samaria is taken about 722. The siege starts in 725 and it lasts for 3 years. And where they took them, and we sometimes refer them as the lost tribes because they scattered them. It was Assyria's policy to take people out of their native country and to disperse them throughout the rest of the world, and to take other nations that they had defeated and put them back into that vacuum of the people that were in Israel. So they didn't just leave the land desolate, but they sent other people back into there as well. And so it neutralized them trying to gather together as a nation, or gather together as brothers and sisters and fight against them. That was the theory of it. And I mean, they scattered them as far as they think they found evidence of them as far as India, I think, that history has shown us.
They would also, in that scattering, they would lose their identity.
Yeah.
You lose your identity, you lose your language, your culture.
Because they didn't just carry out the people of Israel out into other places and scattered them. They did that with all the places
They did that with all of the
so
places.
they mixed them all up in together. So you got a whole. That's why they called them the Samaritans. It was a whole new race.
Do y'all see any similarities? Yeah. Being the gigantic melting pot.
Yeah, that's exactly what happened. For those that haven't stuck to their cultures, it really is. I mean, there's a lot of us that sit there and we go, well, I know way back I had this and but if somebody asks me what am I'm an American. That's it. I know there's Irish, I know there's Scottish, I don't know what else there is, but it's kind of like my dog. Mine's 57.
But Christianity, there's one identity there.
There you go.
Yeah, and that breaks down that barrier wall as we read in Ephesians. That's what Jesus did. It breaks down that wall.
Well, that international coalition of Christians, Jews, and Muslims disturbs me.
That's disturbing. That's disturbing. Okay, let's look at a little bit about Judah. Judah fell eventually too, about 200 years later.
Yeah, the siege there lasted 3 years. But that was actually against the city of Samaria, right?
Yeah, that was against Samaria. If you go back to that the different colors, it's hard to read, but Tilgat, before that they fell, Tiglath-Pileser took a lot of the northern tribes already out of there and had pushed them way out. And then Shalmaneser and Sargon, I don't know, 4th, 5th, 6th, or 7th, whoever, they had a lot of different numbers on their name. But they came in and they were actually there, the deportation, the siege and Sargon's, I think Sargon was the final king that defeated Samaria. But then that even took some of the people that they had deported and they pushed them farther. And some of them migrated on their own. I mean, some of the things that we read about how the Israelites just absorbed into the other populations.
And don't forget, there were many of those other tribes that moved down into Judah. Many people, those tribes, to the point that Jeroboam put up guards to stop them from crossing the border.
Well, and we'll see we'll see a little bit after the return that they were called Jews, but they weren't called by their tribal names anymore.
Yeah, well, there would be those that would identify, but Judah was the main function of the population, so they became Jews.
So the fall of Judah, we had good kings and we had bad kings. We had times when they got associated with the house of Ahab, or they call it the house of Omri, but Ahab was Israel's king, and they kind of started trading brides and things in there, and so that was a pretty low point. But then there's Josiah, there's Hezekiah, there's Asa, there's some other kings that were good kings. Even Manasseh, and Manasseh was one of the worst kings that they had, but half of his kingdom was good, or half of the time that he reigned, he was good, and half of the other half bad. So that you see some wavering, but pretty much this decline is going where we know it's going. And eventually, all of the officers and the priests and the people likewise are exceedingly unfaithful. They followed all of the abominations of the nations. They polluted the house of the Lord that he had made holy in Jerusalem. Solomon was the first one to do that. He's the one that set up idols for his wives to worship inside the temple. He sent them messengers, he sent them prophets, he sent them people, men of God, because he had compassion on his people and on his dwelling place. We read in places like 1 Corinthians 10, where we won't be tempted beyond what we can bear, but with it God will always make a way of escape. He did the same thing with them. He sent them messengers to tell them, you need to change. You need to repent. You need to return to me so that I can return to you. And he made a way of escape. His redemptive plan hasn't changed. It's still the same thing. We sin, he has grace, and he gives us a way out of that.
Because God said, you kill my prophets.
And then they kept mocking his messengers, despising the word, scoffing his prophets, killing the prophets, until the wrath of the Lord rose against his people to where there was no remedy.
Well, and he even tells him, you saw what I did to Israel. How I divorced her.
Yeah, and he said, you're worse than she was, because you saw the example of what happened, and you did this anyway. And so then we get to this point where there is no remedy, where he even tells Jeremiah, quit praying for these people. They're done. I'm done with them. Don't even pray for them. How scary is that? And then in Jeremiah 22, we read, thus says the Lord, and this is the sins of one of the last sons of God. Write this man down as childless, a man who shall not succeed in his days, for none of his offspring shall succeed in sitting on the throne of David and ruling again in Judah. So what does that look like? When you think about the promise that he made to David, your throne's forever. The world, that looks like God has failed. And even to Judah, maybe Judah had even thought, well, he promised us this, but now he's saying this. Is this a false prophet? We're gonna kill him because God told David already, your throne is forever. And Jeremiah is saying, he ain't sitting on the throne anymore. And so somebody's lying. There was a battle of thought between Ezekiel and Jeremiah with the people. Jeremiah said about Jehoiakim, you're going to be taken to the land of Babylon. And Ezekiel said, he'll never see the land of Babylon. So who's telling the truth? Both of them. Because of why? He put his eyes out. Yeah. So, only looking back, when we look at promises and prophecy and things like that, do we see, that one promise is conditional and one promise is unconditional. How does that work? When they were taken into captivity, oh, I got this and it worked. I did some animation on there and actually worked. It transferred.
It works through the faithful remnant through Israel.
He told them that's what it was. Surrender to my servant Nebuchadnezzar, and you'll live. If you try to stay here in Jerusalem, you're going to die. And he told them to surrender and that they would live. He told them where the remnant was going to go. And they were still going on. This promise was to David, it's forever. We're staying here. We're not giving it up. And they perished.
Well, and I think there was strong belief that they were still going to have some kind of earthly kingdom established there. They still didn't comprehend, but the bottom line was they didn't follow his instructions. But
Well, and I think you've got a point there too. They didn't comprehend, and we're going to talk a little bit about prophecy here, and about comprehending prophecy. When it's given, most of the time, it's given to the people of that time. But some of those things don't happen until way later. As a general, prophecy is predicting the future. General rules, we need to accept God's definition and explanation, even the dual purpose ones, waiting for God to show us if there's a dual meaning. Interpretation has to be within the context, the audience, and the purpose of that prophecy are key. And we don't always aren't always going to understand it, even in the context of it. In the Psalms, there's the one, out of Egypt I will call my son. When you pull it out of context, it sounds really obvious, but when you read it in context, you go, that was a prophecy. And many of the prophets didn't even understand what they were saying, and most of prophecy is only understood after the fact. After God says, fulfill that. Isaiah 44:28 is a great example. He says of Cyrus, he is my shepherd. He shall fulfill all of my purpose. That was at least 300 years before Cyrus was even born. A guy named Cyrus was even born, let alone being king of the Medes and the Persians. Most of the time, with prophecy, the best, Occam's razor is the best. The simplest explanation is usually the correct one. A lot of prophecy is very specific in the way that it's told. My servant Nebuchadnezzar, he talks about what Nebuchadnezzar is going to do and what their response to Nebuchadnezzar should be. He tells of what Cyrus is going to do and how he's going to rebuild Jerusalem. Very specific. He tells that a virgin is going to give birth to a son. That's some pretty specific instructions. And you can pinpoint those to one event. We talked about this with prophecy before, how prophets could see the mountain that was right in front of them. But all they saw of the mountains behind were just the little peaks. They weren't able to see how far away those events were. They weren't able to see how all of those events were going to take place. They could only just see little glimpses of it. Like when you're looking at a mountain range, you can see what's right in front of you. And you can see how that would fit into that prophecy, maybe. But you know that there's something else there that God's talking about, but you know to tell when it's going to happen, how far. We have the same thing. We know that Jesus is coming back. We don't know how that's going to take place, and we don't know when it's going to take place. But we know that it's been told that it will take place. A lot of people saw this mountain right in front of them and went with 70 AD, the destruction of everything. Their whole world fell apart. That was the end of the age of Judaism. They saw that as the end of the world. But there was this, that wasn't complete. There was still something farther out there they couldn't see all of. They knew the parts of it.
The prophet's been likened to an archer. I heard this analogy years ago of having a flaming arrow and shooting in the dark at a very great distance, and it'll hit its target. But the prophet didn't know what target exactly it was going to hit.
That's a good analogy. Some of the things in determining double meaning, dual fulfillment, prophecies that have two meanings, you have to kind of, for us, looking back, you have to kind of try to put yourself in the position of the immediate audience. Who's hearing this for the first time, and what does it sound like to them? Because to us, we kind of see the second fulfillment of it, and so that immediate mountain is in the background. And we don't quite understand what maybe it meant to them. A friend of mine that went to Israel one time on one of those tourist trips, he sat down and he talked to an Egyptian man. And he said, you can't think like an Egyptian because you weren't born an Egyptian. You can't think like a Jew because you weren't born a Jew. You don't understand the conflict that we have between the two of us because you're not from this culture. You come from another culture, another nation, another completely different way of thought. So we can see where the prophecies relate to Christ and the church, but we can't expect them to see that. I don't think. We can expect them to see, oh, God's going to set up a spiritual kingdom. His son's going to be in charge, and everybody in the world's going to flock to it. But we read that and we say, yeah, that's exactly what Isaiah said. And then the other, go ahead.
Well, the one that you mentioned there, the virgin, Isaiah said would be birth of John. I believe that there was immediate fulfillment. A young woman would give birth because it tells about things about it.
Yeah, that's an
Other,
interesting
like in Psalms, out of Egypt, I call my son. It doesn't really sound like a real, well, it is prophecy in a way, but some are types or some are figures or something like, when Joseph and Mary took, Jesus into Egypt, and out of Egypt I called my son, but, but
Well,
actual prophecy.
Remember what the definition of a prophet is.
Yeah, it's just speaking, it's speaking words.
A prophet is a mouthpiece for God, a spokesman for God. So whatever's written, that came from God, it was written down. Whether it has an immediate meaning or a future meaning, we kind of divide it, well, that's prophecy and that's just history, but it's all came from God.
There's
It's all
also,
spoken.
in that context, for Isaiah 7, the point that those two kings, they were on the verge of being destroyed. And he says the kingdoms will be done away with. And that was the immediate fulfillment of that, because they see it in their lifetime. Those kingdoms that they were so worried about, God moves and destroys them.
Mhm.
And you even have a point of that it also follows in that land that they're serving, those two lands, both those kingdoms will be forsaken their land. The exile comes, and that's before the virgin birth.
There are,
But
The other
as
thing-
far as turning that virgin birth into a damsel,
We're almost out of time here, so let me run through the rest of these real quick. The most important thing to remember, and Christ told us, that he was the focal point of stuff. Now, they didn't understand that, but they knew that there was a Messiah. But we need to remember when we read it that Christ was the focal point of all prophecies. Prophecies always involve Christ, many times just advancing God's plan of redemption. Jesus is the ultimate fulfillment of dual prophecies in the thing. The other thing that was back on that other slide was in prophecies that types and typologies, the things that Al's been talking about in some of his lessons. These things were set up so we could see a type of remnant. We would understand that there was going to be a remnant out of Judaism. That remnant was going to be the church. That's where God's plan is going, that whole direction. Some of the things that we read in Isaiah, two groups are going to be mentioned in there about eunuchs and foreigners. And then we see these things that he said that this is a message of there's going to be salvation to the nations, salvation to foreigners, salvation to eunuchs, people who keep my Sabbath, hold fast to my covenant, love the name of the Lord, and choose the things that please God. We read this, their burnt offerings and their sacrifices will be accepted on my altar, and then we read in Romans to be a minister of Christ Jesus to the Gentiles in priestly service of the gospel of God, so that the offering of the Gentiles may be acceptable and sanctified by the Holy Spirit. You read these two different things, and you can see things that you read in the New Testament that were told in the Old that were a foreshadowing or a type, or they were actually a dual prophecy that these things would come about. And so there's some other ones, Isaiah 56 and 8, and I will gather yet others to him besides those that I have other sheep that are not of this fold, not of the Jews, and I must bring them in also. Some of the benefits of captivity, real quickly, no more idolatry. We didn't have that afterwards. Some of the Jews, some of the other tribes came back in, but they weren't listed as tribes anymore. There's no more tribal separation. They're Jews. They become one nation. We have the formation of the scribes and the teachers and the rabbinical writings, the first creation of the Torah, or the creation of the Torah, which was the first canonization, putting the 5 books of the Bible together. The synagogue came out of the captivity, learning centers. We look at this and we go, how do we end up with pews and a pulpit and we're all facing one direction and things like that? And all of these things came out of what? Reformation period. A lot of this stuff came out of the Exile. A lot of these things that were completely history-less in the church. We have a lot of things that have been taken from our past. And I had too much information on this one. Sorry. But they knew then that God's plan hadn't failed. That there was still a Messiah to come that was going to sit on David's throne. And that throne would be forever. So they're looking for a Messiah. But unfortunately, they kind of misunderstood a lot of those prophecies. And they were looking for a physical king to take and wage war on their enemies and to raise Israel. They didn't understand the spiritual aspect that God would take this to. He wasn't just going to repeat the same cycle, much like in the creation. He created day and night. He wasn't going to just repeat the same cycle. He was going to put sun and moon and stars in there and divide things up and make it better. So next week we'll do a little bit of a review on the last 7, 8 chapters that we did. We did stop and review some of this so that we can see patterns. Think about patterns that you have seen, and think about things that you have still questions about in God's redemptive plan that either you don't understand or that you learn, and you can see those kind of things happening again today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Well, good morning, how are you?
I ordered this.
Well,
Not bring them by, so we can look at it.
you gotta kind of keep everything low key.
But I want you
But, hey, everything.
You're gonna go reset the motor in the office.
Okay. Use that latest book you give me quite a bit. It's an interesting book.